Understanding China has become more difficult than ever, yet also more important than ever. Hardening geopolitics has made travel to China more difficult, but not impossible. Join me, Scott Kennedy, for an on-the-ground look at China, for conversations with people shaping China and scholars exploring the country firsthand. What makes China tick? Where is the country going? How should the U.S. respond to the China challenge? We'll dive into all this and much more on this podcast. Welcome to China Field Notes. Hello. Welcome to this edition of China Field Notes. I'm Scott Kennedy, the trustee chair in Chinese business and economics, and I'm delighted to have a conversation with Michael Szonyi from Harvard University. Let me explain why. I think all of you know that scholarly exchange is really important to us. It's a central part of the discussion at China Field Notes. And just recently, we had a podcast conversation with Jessica Tietz of Middlebury, who's a fabulous political scientist who studies local governance in China. And she's been doing surveys all around the country of local officials. We just also recently had a conversation with Adam Webb, who's the director of the Hopkins Nanjing Center, who talked about what it's like for students from around the world to be studying in China. I just came back from a few weeks in China, and soon I'll share with the podcast audience some of the things that I saw. But Jessica, Adam, myself, we all study contemporary China today. In some ways, we're journalists recording what's happening, but not just folks who pay attention to today as their vocation are involved in scholarly exchange. There are also historians and others who also travel and find that extremely important. And so I am delighted that we've got Michael Szonyi from Harvard. Let me briefly introduce him, and then we'll launch into the conversation. He is the Frank Wen-Xiong Wu Professor of Chinese History and former director of the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard. A social historian of late, imperial, and modern China, his books include The Art of Being Governed, Everyday Politics in Late Imperial China, which was published in 2017, and Cold War Island, Kamoy on the Front Line, which was published in 2008. His most recent works are The China Questions 2, Critical Insights into U.S. China Relations, which he co-edited with Adele Karai and Jennifer Rudolph in 2022, and Making Meritocracy, Lessons from China and India, From Antiquity to the Present, which he co-edited with Tarun Khanna in 2022. He received his BA from the University of Toronto and DPhil from Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. He's also studied at National Taiwan University and Xiamen University. Man, you have an awesome biography and amazing list of publications, and it's a real super honor, Michael, to have you here on China Field Notes.
Scott, I'm very, very pleased to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So I want to dig in, if we could, at the beginning to your profession and how that links to traveling and doing research in China. But I also want to talk about contemporary affairs and what it's like for you to watch the U.S., China, and others engage with each other. You travel a lot around the region. And since you were director of the Fairbanks Center, you also had to manage all sorts of people who work and engage in China on many different levels. So, as I mentioned at the outset, you're not just any historian, but you're a social historian, and not just any social historian, but one of late imperial and modern China. I think I know what that means, but I really want to hear from you what a social historian is, as opposed to someone who works on political history or diplomatic history. For those of us who are outside the history profession, tell us more about what you do.
Sure. Well, it's a really interesting question and not one that I reflect on very often. So let me start with what social history is, then I can drill down a little bit into what it means to be a social historian of China. So the growth of social history is really part of a larger intellectual project of expanding the scope of history, of expanding who counts as a historical actor and what counts as history. Another way of putting this is history from below. So expanding the scope of history beyond the deliberations of great, mostly men, and political and military matters to looking at the everyday lives of ordinary people, at economic institutions and social structures. This was one of the ways in which the French Annales School really shaped social history, looking at cultural norms. Probably the initial impulse towards social history came from the growth of women's history and the recognition that women have traditionally been excluded from historical accounts, but are obviously an important part of history. That idea of expanding the scope of history has continued, and we're now seeing all kinds of new agents, not just ordinary people, but animal actors, even non-sentient actors. I think the reason why political historians and diplomatic historians and military historians ought to pay attention to social history is that while the movement towards social history began as a kind of way to add to the story, to leave out things that had been forgotten in more narrow versions of history, it turns out to actually change the story. Let me tell you, for example, a little bit about what I learned on Kamoy and what I wrote about on Kamoy to give it a sort of example of what I'm talking about. So lots of your listeners are political scientists. They will have heard of Quemoy and Matsu as a front line in the global Cold War, as a point of confrontation between the Republic of China on Taiwan and the PRC, and also a very significant place for U.S. international relations. One of two of the times in which the U.S. considered the use of nuclear weapons against China were both related to control over Kamoy. These are small archipelago that remained under the control of Chiang Kai-shek during the retreat from the mainland to Taiwan in 1949, and remain to this day under the control of the Republic of China, located only a mile or two off the coast of Fujian in the city of Xiamen. And so this is a story that's been told as a story of IR theory, lots of literature on deterrence. Brinkmanship uses Kamoy. It's been told as a story of international relations history. What I found doing research on Kamoy or oral history, also gathering local archives, is that geopolitical confrontation is not something that happens only in conference rooms and in capitals. Geopolitical confrontation is actually something that's experienced in the everyday lives of the people in these places. It affected, in the case, now Kamoy is a rather extreme case, but if we look at how people made a living, how they married, how they raised families, how they educated their children, even how they prayed at temples, all of these things were deeply affected by geopolitical confrontation. And I think that's a valuable part of our understanding of what IR means.
That is super helpful. I'll say I've been to Kamoy or Jinmun. I went there in 2004 or 5 at the invitation of the foreign ministry in Taipei, and I took a group of scholars. And unlike you, this was, I think, what we would call as research tourism. So we flew to the island. You know, you have to make a quick bank because, as you said, if you don't, you end up in Xiamen, right? And so we landed and we saw the beaches where they had all of those things to stop intruders. And we went, there was a tunnel where I guess the Taiwanese had all of their military things. And there was a big rock that apparently Chiang Kai-shek had said, you know, Huan Wo He Shan, you know, like they were going to eventually retake the mainland. There was a place that you could go to buy these knives that were made out of the shells that Mao and his forces had lobbed at Kamoy. It was really amazing, but we didn't meet locals. We had no really understanding. We got the diplomatic, official political history there. So if we had, what are some of the things we would have learned about the people that live there that we couldn't have had learned just from like going to the knives shop and the tourism that we saw?
Well, first of all, let me thank you for that. I feel great gratitude to the people of Kamoy or Jimen for the way they've supported my research and helped my research over the years. And so I really appreciate the plug for Kamoy tourism. You can now reach it if you have a multiple entry visa. You can reach it by a short ferry boat from China, or you can fly from Taiwan. If you do go to the knife store and tell them Song Yiming sent you. and you'll get a very good deal. So I think I'm also a big fan, by the way, of research tourism. I think people should take advantage of it wherever they can. So if you want to know the answer to Scott's larger question, go buy my book. There's an English edition, which is still available. There's a Taiwanese edition that is still available. For obvious reasons, there is no simplified character edition. But if you are in China, I would encourage you to find a pirate edition and download it.
And I know giving up your royalties there.
Well, no. When the Chinese language edition first came out, I was traveling to China, and students would rush up to have me sign basically their downloaded photocopy. But I want people to read the book. So let me just give you one example. I'll give you two examples, actually. One was the way the local economy was transformed by geopolitics. The population of Kamoy in the 1950s was around 40,000. It's still a national secret, but I've done a pretty good job, I think, at calculating the military population. Now, there were over 100,000 soldiers stationed on Kamoy. We can get into a little bit the reasons for this. Part of it was actually Chiang Kai-shek trying to force the U.S. to not force the ROC to give up Quemoy, because Chiang Kai-shek wanted to make the case that it was essential to the defense of Taiwan and, at least in the early period, essential to the recovery of the mainland. But so Quemoy became one of the most entrepreneurial societies that I think has ever existed in human history. The number of registered small businesses was approximately 60% of the total population. So basically every family had a registered business. And what that showed was the way ordinary people adapt to the weird economy of a highly militarized society. And of course, that has all kinds of parallels. It looks a lot like Okinawa. It looks a lot like Fort Bragg. So we can use Kamoy as a case study for how the presence of a large military reshapes economic life. Just a quick second example. The 50s and 60s is, of course, and 70s, of course, when Taiwan is becoming a modern industrial society. One of the things that happens in a modern industrial society is the age of marriage typically goes up. And it goes up for a bunch of reasons, having to do with female education, having to do with job opportunities for women and so on, declining control of the senior generation. In Kamoy, the marriage age dropped, and it dropped very dramatically. And I met people who in the 1960s had been married at the age of 13, 14. And the reason was that the marriage market had become totally distorted by the weird sex ratio. 40,000 population, so let's just say 20,000 men, 20,000 women, and 100,000 soldiers. So the overall sex ratio was 120 to 20. And so what that did was it raised the value of women on the marriage market. And so on the one hand, officers, many of them older men from the mainland, in some cases who had left wives behind on the mainland. So I don't want to tell this just as a story of statistics. It's also a story of personal tragedy. Yeah. They married women from Kamoy, but concerned that they would not be able to find brides for their own sons, the people of Kamoy basically tried to marry off their daughters before they entered the marriage market. And so one of the really interesting things is that there were all kinds of analyses and reports that the Taipei government was trying to do it, which basically boiled down to these people are not very civilized. We need to modernize. And one of the ways we know they're not very civilized is, look, they're marrying their daughters off at 12 or 13. And the point of my story, of course, is that this was actually entirely a product of national policy, right? If the soldiers had not been there, this wouldn't have happened. But having happened, it then became something that the local people were blamed for. So it's a nice example, I think, of the way national policy, and in this case, a particular kind of geopolitical confrontation, distorts the development of a society. Lots more stories like that in the book.
Yes. Okay. So everyone should go buy the book, and hopefully the one that gets Michael some royalties. But even if not, he'll be happy to sign a copy for you,
indeed.
No matter what. And I guess what you're saying, again, going back to the original question, just to draw this full circle, is when you're doing social history as opposed to diplomatic or political history, the periodization of history and we talk about, whether it's this dynasty or that dynasty or wars, that stuff still matters. But the way it plays out doesn't necessarily unfold according to the original story that we're aware of. And so that's important. If you want to really understand the dynamics of communities, then you really have to look at things from this bottom-up perspective. I think that's what you're telling us. Do I got that right?
Absolutely. And let me actually just use this as an opportunity to plug one of the books I'm working on now, which is a bigger book. I hope we'll talk about it more later. It's a history of modern China told entirely from the perspective of rural society. And one of the things we realize whether it's doing oral history, whether it's gathering village archives, is that so there's a very powerful conventional periodization for China in the 20th century, with 1911 as a turning point, 1949 as a turning point, and 1978 as a turning point. And it's as if nothing that happened before any of those turning points matters to anything that happened after those turning points. And looking at the social historical approach reveals that that's just completely not how this history was experienced by the people we're purporting to describe. There are discontinuities that we don't expect, continuities that we don't expect, shuffling the periodization away from the one that makes most sense in Beijing or Taipei or Washington really changes our perspective on what has happened in history.
That's super helpful. It's obviously something that folks like me, when we go to companies and look at industries in China, that everything doesn't unfold according to the way official policy laid out by some bureaucrats in Beijing describe it. And so you really have to see how those industries behave, how entrepreneurs act. I think that's a parallel. Let me ask you now, as we turn towards some of your other work, when I think about historians going to China, I initially think about you showing up at the National Archives in Beijing or in Nanjing, in case it's the Republican period, and knocking on the door and saying, I want to get the record of this under this emperor or this problem, and then doing a lot of copying or handwriting or replacing or photographing and or all that kind of stuff. But if you're doing social history, I imagine that just showing up at the National Archives is not necessarily where you're going to get the most important information for your research that you want to tell. So what does a social historian of modern and imperial China do when they land in China? What's the research look like?
Sure. Well, let me first of all point out that what I'm going to tell you about is what I do as a late imperial Chinese historian. There's still amazing, wonderful research being done by people who knock on the door of the first historical archives and read the text here. There's also, well, perhaps less true for you, but for historians, the Chinese historical archive is effectively an infinite archive. There's a lot of talk with the rise of technology about the creation of infinite data sets. For all intents and purposes, the Chinese data set has always been infinite because it's always been far more than anyone, even a native speaker, could read in a million lifetimes. So I'm not going to say that all social historians do this or should do this. This is what I do. And it goes back to my own scholarly background. So I belong to, or I'm associated with, a school of historical research called the South China School, the Huanan Xuepai, or the School of Historical Anthropology. And I was trained in that tradition, and it's the kind of history that I find most exciting. And it involves actually, part of the sort of core practice is gathering materials precisely that are not in the National Archive. So I travel around rural China and I gather genealogies, I gather stone inscriptions that are still found in millions of villages around China. I gather deeds and contracts. That's the main subject of my other book that I hope we'll come back and talk about. So in a sense, for me, travel to China actually creates the archive that I make use of. And what we find is that when we read the locally produced archive, we get a very different vision of Chinese history from what we get reading the archive of the state, and also reading the archive that's produced by the elite of Chinese history. So the literati, the scholars, who of course wrote, endless amounts. And I don't want to be dismissive of what they wrote, but social historians can find a very different version of history. Let me just give you one example. It comes from my very first book, Practicing Kinship. And it actually touches on, I think, a kind of conventional wisdom about China. Lots of people think that, well, we all know that the family is very important in China. And in South China, there are these huge organizations of kinship groups called clans or lineages. And of course, everyone knows that that's just part of Chinese tradition, that it goes back. So there's either it's just, somehow Chinese people have a kinship gene that leads them to organize themselves into groups, or maybe Confucius said this, or maybe Zhu Xi said this in the 13th, 12th century. So a social historian says that it just feels wrong to give a few intellectuals such power over shaping society. And what we find when we read genealogies, which are in a sense the private archives of families, we realize that this kind of organization into kinship groups, in the South, of course, we see these beautiful ancestral halls where the kin gather to do rituals and they compile genealogies and they own all kinds of property. People who work on land reform know that they were substantial landowners. What we find actually is that these institutions are actually of relatively recent vintage. I realize for a political scientist, this may not be evident, but they didn't actually exist until probably the 14th or 15th century. So 500 years for a historian is still recent vintage. And they arise out of a number of factors. I think my own contribution is that they arise to a very significant degree out of ordinary people trying to manipulate the tax system to their own advantage. And then they dress this up in a language that would have made Confucius or Zhu Xi happy. But the reality is that they're being driven by very material considerations. And one of the things that's most interesting is that this kind of organization of rural society is already coming under attack by the 19th century, and is then, of course, comes under a devastating attack in the 20th century. On the one hand, it's quite interesting to see that, and again, we come back to periodization, which you mentioned earlier, to see that actually this form of organization and this set of cultural norms that we associate with antiquity actually has quite a short history, a few hundred years, from the mid-Ming to the late Qing. The other interesting thing is, there's lots of statistical work on this and also lots of ethnographic work, kinship remains enormously important in contemporary China. It matters to access to capital, it matters to the scale of enterprises and so on. So tracing how kinship has changed through history and it's changing motivating factors and its changing dimensions is something that social historians are really interested in, with actually some interesting contemporary consequences.
This is really valuable for those of us who pay attention to primarily contemporary China, because we do read some history, but we don't read enough social history. And we are, fed a basic story that says China's had 3,000 or 5,000 years of unbroken history, and it's always been this way, and so, etc. And I've learned the more that I look at the work of historians and others that actually there's been a lot of change over time that doesn't necessarily fit with that straightforward, simple narrative. I know why that narrative is described that way, but this is super helpful. Also,
can I just jump in, Scott, with one comment?
Sure.
So I teach every year at the Canadian School of Public Service. I give some, which is, as I tell Chinese friends, is the closest Canada has to a Zhongyang Dangxiao, a central party school. And one of the things that I try to convey to public officials who are engaging with China is that China has 5,000 years of X, or China is always like this. You want to learn to recognize that statements like that are always politically interested. They're always being made in support of something else. And you'll be a more effective public servant, and I would argue you'll be a more effective businessman, you'll be a more effective political scientist, if you learn to recognize when those politically interested arguments are being made and perhaps why they're being made. And I think history helps us a lot. I don't actually think that Canadian public officials need to know all 24 dynasties, but if they are attuned to the way simplifying arguments are connected to the political agendas of their Chinese interlocutors, it positions them better to represent the interests of Canada. So that's the particular context in which this comes to my mind. Everyone benefits from an awareness of the extraordinary complexity and change over time of what gets lumped under the rubric Chinese culture.
I don't know if you'd endorse this other book, but Bill Hatton has written this book called The Invention of China, which describes how the language has changed, the description of themselves, the different discussion of ethnic minorities, all that kind of stuff has evolved and changed over time. I do think that part of it is like an intentional framing of a narrative that sort of justifies the current leadership of the party and what they're trying to do. But I also think there's just a lot of Chinese who've just been educated that way, and they probably just aren't aware that they are being given a civics education that is
I want to take back my earlier point. It's not that every claim about China is a smokescreen concealing an agenda, but I still think, being aware of the relationship between the historical experience and the way that experience is narrated and represented, that's helpful in a whole bunch of different contexts. It's actually, I think, why at this moment of some crisis in the liberal arts and humanities in American education, it's why a history education is still a valuable asset or valuable training.
For sure. So let's dig a little bit and talk a little bit more about the type of documents that you collect and the stories that they tell. One of the things that I didn't mention that's in your biography is that in 2024, you were made an honorary villager of Yong Thai, which is southwest of Fuzhou, the capital of Fujian. And, I've traveled around a lot in China, so I like to not only visit a place once, I like to go multiple times. I've never been made an honorary blank of any place in China. And so that's pretty amazing. So give us a little look into Yong Thai and the type of the story that is developing from the documentary evidence that you're collecting and the people that you're meeting.
Sure. Okay. Well, it requires jumping back and forth in time, but I hope that's okay. A shout out to you for promoting Kamoy tourism. Yong Thai is a fascinating place if you're in Fuzhou. And of course, with infrastructure now in China being the way it is, if you're in Xiamen or Fuzhou, you can get to Yong Thai in an hour. Whereas when I was a student there, it was a full day's journey. And I should also thank the county government of Yong Thai and the people of Yong Thai for this great honor. Here's the background to it. About 10 years ago, an architectural preservation firm, which had been hired to rebuild this majestic old home in Yong Thai. They're beautiful mahogany homes in Yong Thai. It's a highland county up in the mountains, as you say, outside of Fuzhou. They discovered a chest of documents literally in the rafters. And they didn't know what to make of these documents, which were basically illegible to them. And so they called a research center with which I'm associated, the Center for Research into Local Historical Documents at Xiamen University, and said, come and tell us what to do with these documents. And the documents turned out to be another kind of personal archive. They were the archive of the property transactions and economic transactions of the family that had owned this home since it was built in the Qing. And we soon learned, and so I was brought into the project, we soon learned that virtually every family in many villages in Yong Thai has a similar archive or a chest of documents. It's a podcast, so I can't show you visuals, but if you go to my website, you can see some pictures of what these documents look like. And in many cases, these are collections of land deeds and contracts and account books for local moneylenders, stretching back sometimes to the mid-Ming, to the 15th century, and carrying forward all the way to 1949. And we see some records of obviously rather ill-fated land purchases in October of 1949. So after liberation, but before the communists have arrived in Yong Thai, people are acquiring land, which of course, a year or two later is going to have devastating consequences. Oops, because exactly. So when I went to school, we were told that there were no surviving documents from ordinary society, except in one place in Anhui, Huizhou. It turns out that they're all over the place. In Yong Thai alone, we've now gathered over 150,000 discrete documents. And my colleagues at Xiamen are trying to publish them, but it's a hopeless task because we publish a bunch of volumes thinking we published, I think, 100 volumes so far. We think we've got all of the volumes from one family, and then more documents are discovered. So the thing about these documents is, I think there are two things. One is that the documents individually are quite mundane. They say, I, Scott, couldn't pay my taxes, or I had to pay for my dad's funeral, or I was short of money, so I sold this land to Michael. And so the document actually sits in my personal archive recording that it's a legitimate sale. What I've just told you is a very mundane story. But when it's placed in a historical context that traces the history of that land for hundreds of years, from, for example, primordial forest to secondary forest that people are using to grow bamboo or for paper making or grow mushrooms, to ultimately to paddy field, we can turn these very mundane documents into a narrative. And so that's the one thing that's really interesting. The other thing is that the documents are still in the hands of the people who produced them. Oh, sorry, the descendants of the people who produced them. And so we can actually, I spend a lot of time now walking the land with old people in Yong Thai, figuring out how and why their ancestors acquired this plot of land and what it meant. So, for example, we see immigrants to the village initially renting land in the more marginal highlands. And then as they become more settled and wealthier, they move down the hillside and are renting and eventually purchasing paddy fields. And so a picture of the growth of the local economy develops. And then we see them ultimately investing in timber because the forestry, so there's a connection to the larger economy. As the cities on the coast are growing, there's demand for timber. And so we see them investing in timber. One of the things that is just mind-blowing for me about these documents is they show the extraordinary capacity of ordinary Chinese peasants, in many cases illiterate or semi-literate, to securitize their property. That is, to take things that they have and turn them into assets that can be used as collateral for loans, as sources of investment. I'll give you just two quick examples. Land, it's easy to parcel out. You can divide the land. You could sell off some of the land when you die, and your children, if you have two children, each of them or two sons, each of them can take the land. There are ginkgo trees in Yong Thai, and ginkgo trees produce nuts, and the nuts can be used for a couple of things. They can be used for Chinese medicine. They can be used as a foodstuff. They also contain arsenic, and so they can be used in the silver mining business or silver processing business. But the problem is that you can't divide a tree, right? If you try to chop the tree, if you, Scott, you and I are brothers, and we divide the estate, and you want your half of the tree and I want my half of the tree. If we chop the tree down, we both of us have nothing. And so what happens is that when we inherit the estate, we divide the income stream from the tree into two. And so all of a sudden now we are a corporation that owns shares in the tree. And with the passage of time, the shares might get smaller and smaller. I found documents asserting a 1/128th ownership share in a tree. So on the one hand, it's just mind-blowingly cool. I've actually found some of these trees, and so I can trace these trees back for hundreds of years. But the intellectually significant payoff is that you can see how in cash-poor societies, ordinary people come up with ways to turn a share in the annual income of a stream of nuts produced by a tree into collateral that they can use for a loan. So one of the big lessons is just the extraordinary sophistication of ordinary Chinese people.
Absolutely. What I like about the way that you do history is it feels a lot more relatable to me, and then just reading this emperor issued this edict, they invaded this place, or there was this problem. This sounds like how people actually lived, and that kind of demystifies China for me and brings it home.
I didn't finish the story. I just realized. Let me just
okay.
add 2 sentences. No, I finished the anecdote, but you asked about why I'm an honorary villager of Yong Thai, and I kind of lost sight of that in my excitement over the documents. So the story then is that I began teaching a course on these documents at Harvard, And the people of Yong Thai got very, very excited about this. And they gave me a research studio in an old house in Yong Thai. And I now go back every year and we teach seminars. We've done 3 years of an international seminar in reading documents for students from Harvard, students from all over China, and now students from all over the world, using Yong Thai as a kind of point of entry into the use of local documents. And unfortunately, the local government in Yong Thai, while being extremely supportive, would like me. Yong Thai is a rural county in a very bad way right now, as many predominantly rural counties are. We can come back and talk to that. I think the Yong Thai county government was very keen for me to publicize Yong Thai in the hope of making some kind of contribution to its economic development. Unfortunately, I can't really do that as a historian, but it's nonetheless a great honor that they paid to me by making me, after almost a decade and interrupted by COVID, after a decade of research, they bestowed on me this great honor, which is much cooler than most of the other honors I've received.
Well, congratulations. And folks who are listening to this podcast are going to learn about Yong Thai and they're going to read your work. And so I'm happy to use this as a window into parts of China that especially Western audiences aren't as familiar with that they should. Two little questions here. First, before we get to the final topic I wanted to talk about with you about U.S. China relations, China's relationship with the world. I guess first, just very technical. All those documents, you said there's so many of them. I wonder if at some point you throw AI at this problem and allow them to figure it out. And then the second one is because of collectivization, those folks who unfortunately did deals in between the initial liberation and when the party and the military showed up, will those records, does that have any effect on what people consider to be their property, land, their tree these days? Is this have some consequence? China's trying to implement or thinking about implementing a property tax. And so I wonder, is there going to be any kind of contemporary consequence for the historical digging that you all are doing?
So the AI question is a great one. It turns out that we haven't solved actually the OCR problem. These are handwritten documents written by people who aren't very literate, so they've got bad handwriting. They also make lots of mistakes in the characters. And one day I'm gonna I hope I'll meet Jack Ma or somebody and say, I need you to throw real AI at this question. But so far we haven't actually been able to solve that problem. One thing that's really interesting is that I can see I have students transcribing as best they can, the deeds. And I can see that every time I teach a course, so ChatGPT and the other AIs don't do very well with these deeds, but they get better every time I teach a course. So I'm actually seeing AI, and of course the reason they get better is my students are using it. So yeah, there's an AI element to this. There's also a broader digital humanities approach to this, which is that I am doing all kinds of case studies, in some cases, extremely moving case studies, as we turn these mundane deeds into relatable stories. Ultimately, I want to create tools that people can use for similar research on other parts of China. And ultimately, I want to ask, how do these stories scale up? That is to say, do these accounts do they speak to broader phenomenon? Because, of course, when you work on local history like I do, people always say, well, that's Yong Thai, but what about my village? And of course, when I talk about these things in China and I give cases, people always say, well, that's an interesting story, but it's not really representative. You know what would be representative? My town. So come and do my...
Yes. Well, I mean, China's got 800,000 villages. So, I mean, you can't... Average isn't necessarily what really you want to know.
No, indeed.
Yeah. So let's turn totally contemporary now, because not only were you director of the Fairbanks Center, which means that you are managing faculty and projects and lectures that deal with a lot of things, including contemporary China, but you were also a member of the Public Intellectuals Program for the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. And in fact, that's when we first met in 2008-9, where we, through that program, learned about how to engage the public conversation about China as opposed to just speaking to our colleagues in our respective professions. I know that's something that you've always been interested in. It's not the National Committee isn't the folks that got you going. Which is probably why they were interested. So how do you think of yourself as a public intellectual and the engagement with China on its relationship with the world?
Well, I imagine that many of your previous guests have also been members of the Public Intellectuals program. And I imagine that many of us probably come to the issue in some ways shaped by the same individual, which is Ezra Vogel, who really was a profound influence on me. Although we work on very different intellectual areas, was a real mentor to me. And I think really persuaded me, and I think probably many others of your guests, and perhaps you even yourself, Scott, of the responsibility that we have to go beyond our narrow intellectual or our narrow academic concerns. For most of my career, I've done some advising work first for the Canadian government. I'm a Canadian by birth, and then for the American government when I moved to Harvard about 20 years ago. And the Public Intellectuals program, I think, really got me thinking much more about two things, really. The first is the importance of historical understanding for making good policy. And it comes back to something we spoke about a few moments ago about the ways in which historical claims and historical narratives can be politically interested in China. That can be politically interested in the United States as well. And sort of recognizing that attending to the politics behind historical stories can be very productive in shaping conversations. And then the second thing was, and this really was something I hadn't really thought about, this is something I really learned about from Ezra and all of my PIP fellows. And this has actually become much more important, I would say, post-bilateral downturn, post-decoupling, which is that when we engage with the Chinese public, when we engage with Chinese intellectuals, we're doing something that goes beyond simply intellectual exchange. I've always benefited enormously from working with Chinese colleagues. And in fact, I think I often joke that so I mentioned earlier the Huanan Xuepai, the South China School. I think I've had much of the success I've had, professional success, because I serve as the Huanan Xuepai's agent in America. That is to say, I'm the middleman in selling what they're selling. But I think there's also a political dimension to that, which is that when we travel to China now, and this is one of the reasons why I'm still going to China often, why I spent the first post-COVID year almost entirely in China, there's a political dimension to that. We're sending a message to Chinese colleagues who are under some pressure. We can go into that a little bit if there's time. We're sending a message to Chinese colleagues that American scholars still have their back and still want to work with them. We're sending a message to the United States that we think continued engagement is important. We are building a pipeline. Ezra used to often talk about the difficult days of the 1950s and 1960s and the need to prepare for when things turned around. I'm very concerned, as I think you are as well, that the current downturn in the relationship and the securitization of the relationship is going to affect the number of Americans who study China and the way Americans study China. I don't know where the China-US relationship is going, but this is not the time for Americans to know less about China. Whether we're going to be competitors with China or friends with China or rivals with China, this is not the time for us to know less. And so part of the responsibility of the public intellectual, I think now, is to convey that knowing more about China is actually very much in America's interest. It's absolutely the right thing to do. So those are sort of some of the things that I'm thinking about as a public, in my public role, and as I think about my responsibilities to travel to China. I think I was probably, for the foreseeable future, the last director of the Fairbanks Center for whom the job was almost always fun. It became a much more difficult job over the terms of my tenure. And I worry sometimes when they write the 100th year history of the Fairbanks Center, they're going to say, oh, well, under the directorship of Szonyi, U.S. China relationships went down the tubes. It won't really be my fault, but there'll be something to it. But I think, it's not as easy to live up to the ideas that I just articulated. It's not as easy. There are risks now to engaging with China. There are risks in China, there are risks in America. There are impediments and obstacles, but I still think it's worth doing. And let me actually just make one last comment about complexity and learning about China. One of the most striking things that I learned when I went back to China last year was everything I'd read in the media about the dystopian surveillance regime was true. People are monitored in China in ways that we would find very uncomfortable. What surprised me was that most people, most of the time, actually welcome that. So I went back to the village where I did my PhD research. This is a village I've been going to for 30 years, almost 40 years. And the individual houses of the village, at the end of the day, they would bar the door with a giant beam of timber to be safe at night. They don't have to do that anymore. This is not, of course, an endorsement of that surveillance regime. This is not a comparison of the two systems, but simply to say that if you want to understand what's going on in China today and how that's perceived by ordinary Chinese people, on the ground encounters with ordinary Chinese people. I don't, of course, research surveillance regimes. I don't research the social credit system. But just spending time in China, just talking to people, gives you insight into China that I think is absolutely invaluable.
I really appreciate that. Of course, you're preaching to the choir here.
Of course.
And, I would say that the risks of traveling in both directions are higher. Of course, there's also the concern that you don't learn as much because if you're in certain kinds of meetings and certain kinds of audiences, you can get spoon-fed a story that is not reflective of reality. I think actually seeing what they're trying to spoon feed you is still something that you can learn from. But then there's also unscripted moments. And of course, if you're traveling in different parts of the country, then you can triangulate. And if you do it over 30 plus years, as you've been doing, you can compare over time, all of which is valuable. And so, I've been on a mission to make sure we avoid scholarly decoupling with China. And we're down to, I think, 1,500 to 2,000 U.S. students, which I'll say is not as bad as others. I met folks from the Norwegian embassy in Beijing. There are 80 students from Norway in China right now. I know Norway only has 5.6 million people, but nevertheless, that's a very small number. And of course, it's not just the numbers. It's how you interact, what you can do, and things. So, and I agree that basically, ignorance is not the basis of a great strategy. So maybe just to bring this to a conclusion, so you've been working on China for 3+ decades now, looking into these archives or creating your own archives, bringing new students, new generation of scholars to China. What are your biggest worries about where China is headed? What are the things that give you some hope about where China is headed?
Let me actually answer the second part first and tell you something that gives me a great deal of hope about U.S. China relations, which is as I travel around China. So I spent the academic year 23-24 in China, and that was the longest extended period I've spent in many years after, needless to say, as you know, the longest absence from China of my professional career because of the pandemic. And one of the things that really struck me, and this was true with my colleagues in the university, it was true with my tennis partners in the Xiamen Municipal Tennis Club, and it was true with ordinary people that I met all over China, was I think ordinary Chinese people, for the most part, are largely unaware of how badly the U.S.-China relationship has deteriorated. And that sounds like a condescending remark, but it's actually not. The point is that in a society where information is controlled, there are ways to get access to outside information, but most people don't. Most people take the information that they're given. In a society where access to information is controlled, the most widespread view is going to be the product of some decisions that are made at the center. And so I found the optimism about U.S.-China relations, the idea that this was a difficult time, but not an impossible time, to be quite encouraging, because what that says to me is that someone in Beijing thinks that there's room for improvement. Now, whether that improvement will be realized is, of course, another question, and I leave that to people like you who work on the bilateral relationship to explore. People in China will not be surprised if the relationship could be rescued. And that, I think, is a really heartening message. Having said that, to quote my colleague Graham Allison, who I'm sure was quoting someone else, my expectation on the bilateral relationship is things are going to get worse before they get worse. That is to say, I don't think the future is very bright. It's one of the reasons why I am spending as much time in China as I can right now, because I think the chances are high of further academic decoupling in the years to come. I am the beneficiary of 40 years of deliberately ethically minded engagement with Chinese colleagues and ordinary Chinese people. I'm able to enjoy the kinds of access I have now and do the kinds of things I do now on the basis of that engagement. And so I think it's really, really important for people to mindful of the risks. And of course, I would never be critical of anyone who says there's no point in going to China, or it's too scary to go to China, or it's too risky to China. Building those relationships is absolutely crucial. But to come back to your question about the future of U.S. China relations, I think we all know that the U.S. and China have to get along, right? We have to get along for the sake of the global economy. We have to get along for the sake of the future of the planet. We have to get along for the sake of public health threats and so on. Sadly, I don't think the domestic will to put those longer term considerations first is there yet in either China or in the United States. And so that sort of sums up my pessimism. I think that we haven't talked at all today about Taiwan, but I think the Taiwan situation, I'm actually fairly optimistic about. The likelihood of direct military action is low, but that's probably the subject of another podcast. But I think the likelihood of continued gray zone and informal pressure is high. I don't think there's a great strategy in either the US or in China for dealing with the consequences of that issue for the bilateral relationship. So there are lots of storm clouds on the horizon. I think as academics and as intellectuals, part of our job is to be sober-minded and draw attention to those, but also to continue to engage on a person-to-person level, both because it's important in its own right, but also laying a foundation for a more stable and a more healthy long-term relationship.
Amen to all of that. Absolutely. Michael, this has been a fantastic conversation. My respect for you has always been high, but it's now I'm on cloud nine because of what you do as a historian and helping bring history to life and make it relatable for those of us who are not professional historians, and how you make it valuable for thinking about where China and its place in the world is today. Although I know that for historians, it's not just about explaining the past to serve the present, but also as your work as a public intellectual, as a teacher for the students that are at Harvard, but for the rest of us who are learning from you and everything. I just want to say thank you for all the work you're doing. And of course, thank you for joining China Field Notes.
Thanks so much, Scott. We're both members of the same choir that we're preaching to. Let me thank you for hosting me. It's been a fun conversation, which I hope some people will find interesting. And also thank you for the work you do, which ultimately I think is directed by the same impulses as mine. So thank you.
Thank you. All right. Thanks for listening to China Field Notes. Stay up to date with our latest releases by following us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to great content. Until next time.